Cathedral Yard, Exeter, in the soft, pale grey, Devon Saturday afternoon of the 20th of November in the year of our Lord, 1819. Madam, I write to you, by the warm permission and at the considered instruction of the late Mrs. Honoria Prideaux of Prideaux Court, in the parish of Prideaux Magna, in the western part of Devon, widow, who departed this life on Tuesday the 16th of November, last in the 73rd year of her age at her country residence aforesaid, and whose last will and testament has been admitted to probate at the Prerogative Court at Exeter this present Saturday the 20th. By the said will, my late client has devised and bequeathed to you her great niece, being the only surviving child of her nephew, the late Reverend Hadrian Prideaux, lately curate of St. Petrox of Exeter, the whole of her real and personal estate, comprising, firstly, the dwelling-house called Prideaux Court, together with 166 acres of home pasture, the walled south garden, the apple orchard, the exercise meadow, and all appurtenances. Secondly, the contents of the South Library, being 396 volumes principally classical and historical, the Prideaux family plate of 86 pieces, marked Exeter 1789, and all household goods and chattels. Thirdly, the further sum of £3,450 in the 3% consolidated annuities at the Bank of England, the whole to be held in fee simple absolute, to your own sole and separate use. My late client did not in your lifetime come over to Exeter. She had been at Prideaux Court these 28 years since her marriage to Sir Theodore Prideaux in 1791, corresponding with your late father at the quarter days. She had your father's account of your chess correspondence with Mr. Lewis and Mr. Sarrat at every Lady Day return from 1815. She has bequeathed, in addition, the Wedgwood Jasperware chess set of 1796 and the Philidor 1749 first edition that have stood at the South Library writing table these 28 years. Mrs. Carew the housekeeper, Mr. Champernowne the steward, and Mr. Trembath the butler are under my instruction to expect you at the south porch on the Saturday following your warm convenience. I am, Madame, your most obedient and humble servant, Paul Whaley, solicitor at Exeter. The Saturday of the 20th of November, in the year 1819, lay over the parish of St. Petrox of Exeter in the soft, pale grey of a Devon autumn that meant the Exe was running high under the bridge, and that the cathedral close was hushed for the prayers of the morning office. At the parsonage on the lower side of the close, in the south parlour that looked out upon the small walled garden, and beyond the garden upon the slow brown water of the Exe estuary, Francis Prideaux was at the chessboard at the window. Francis Prideaux was tall, 5'6", and upright with the considered gravity of the Devon parsonage, soft, dark hair plaited at the nape under a plain dark mourning cap, calm grey-blue eyes the colour of the Exe estuary at autumn, fair Devon complexion in unrelieved black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt the testatrix. The board was a plain mahogany, inlaid in walnut at the squares, a parsonage board, no jasperware about it. The pieces were the boxwood and ebony that her late father, the Reverend Hadrian Prideaux, had given her at her 16th year in the long Devon summer of 1807. The board stood at the small parlour table that her mother, Mrs. Cassandra Prideaux, had set under the south window in 1808, 2 years before her own death. The window gave out upon the garden wall and the estuary beyond. The south parlour held no clock at the wall, only the cathedral bells across the close, to mark the hours, and Francis at the chessboard did not need to be told the hour by any other means than the bells of St. Petrox at the quarters. The position upon the board was move 14 of a correspondence game with Mr. Jacob Sarrat of Vauxhall Bridge Road, London, Mr. Sarrat the leading English chess theorist these 10 years past, author of the 1808 Treatise on the Game of Chess in 2 octavo volumes, against whose positional play Francis had been writing for 4 years upon the side of Philidor's open game theory of the Analyse du jeu des échecs of 1749. The game was a king's gambit, excepted that Mr. Sarrat had opened by post on the 3rd of October last. Mr. Sarrat had played the gambit at the second move, and Francis had taken the pawn at the king's bishop's square. Mr. Sarrat had pushed the king's knight to the king's bishop's third, and Francis had answered with the king's knight to her king's bishop's third in the Philidorian manner. The game had run for 13 moves at the steady measured pace of the Exeter and London posts. Mr. Sarrat's last letter had reached Francis on the Tuesday previous, and had set out his 14th move in the careful italic he kept for chess correspondence. The bishop to the queen's bishop's fourth, attacking the knight at the king's bishop's third, and threatening the sacrifice at the king's bishop's seventh in the Italian manner. Francis had read the move twice, through at the window in the Tuesday morning, and had set it upon her board at the south parlour, and had let it stand at her hand the 3 days following, while she read Philidor's analysis of the King's Gambit, accepted at pages 84 through 92 of the 1749 first edition that her father had set into her hand at her 17th year. The Saturday morning had arrived with the answer settled in her hand. She would not retreat the knight, nor would she interpose. She would, in the Philidorian manner, push the queen's pawn to her queen's fourth and offer the central counter, which the position at her board had carried at every reading. She set her hand to the boxwood queen's pawn and moved it 2 squares forward. The move stood upon the board in the level grey light of the south window, and Francis drew the green-calf chess journal across the parlour table to record it. The journal was the 3rd of her green-calf chess journals. She had begun the first at Lady Day of 1815, when Mr. William Lewis of the chess room at St. James's Street had answered her first letter of analysis, and the 3rd had been opened at Lady Day of the present year 1819. She kept the volumes at the parlour writing desk, wrapped in cream linen against the Devon damp. She had her father's quill at her hand, and the small parsonage inkwell at the table. She wrote at the head of the page the date of the day in her even script, Saturday, 20th November, 1819. Mr. Sarrat's King's Gambit accepted, the 14th move at Mr. Sarrat's hand, BC4, and the 14th move at my hand, PQ4, Philidorian centre. Below the entry, she wrote the careful note in the side margin she always kept for analysis. The knight at KB3 will not be moved. The central counter holds the diagonal. The bishop's sacrifice at KB7 cannot now be carried, the king's knight covering the square. She had set the quill in the inkstand, and was drawing the blotting paper across the page when the parlour bell rang at the south door. Mrs. Trembath, the parsonage housekeeper, had gone down to answer. The lower bell of the house was a small parish bell, and Francis had grown accustomed at her father's curacy to know the difference between the morning postboy at his ring and a parishioner at his knock, and this was a clerk's knock, the firm even rap of a man on solicitor's business. She set the chess journal aside, and drew her dark shawl over the black gabardine, and waited at the parlour table for the message to be brought up. The message came up at the hand of Mr. Polwell's clerk, young Mr. Polwell Champernowne, who was the solicitor's nephew lately of the chambers at Cathedral Yard. He stood at the parlour door with the letter at his glove, and bowed and said only in the level Devon manner that Mr. Polwell the solicitor at Exeter sent his warm respects to Miss Prideaux, and begged her to read the enclosed at her settled leisure, and that no answer was looked for at the present morning. He laid the letter at the parlour table at her hand, bowed a second time, and withdrew. Francis heard the south door close after him, and the small parlour fall again into the level grey hush of the November morning at the X. She broke the seal, Polwell's plain dark wax with the small Exeter mark, and unfolded the letter at the parlour table beside the chessboard. The hand was the close even copperplate of the solicitor's chambers, in the soft pale grey ink, the Exeter chambers had used these 40 years past. She had known Mr. Polwell since her father's curacy, and the hand at her eye was familiar. She read the letter through at the parlour table without rising. She read it through a second time. She set it down at the table beside the Philidor open at page 90, and she sat at the chessboard at the window with her hand at the green-calf cover of the journal and let the matter settle. The matter was very plain. Her great-aunt, Mrs. Honoria Prideaux, had died at Prideaux Court at her 73rd year on the Tuesday of the 16th of November, 4 days since, and had left to Francis by her last will, and testament admitted to probate at Exeter, that present Saturday, the whole of the Prideaux estate, the house and 166 acres of home pasture, the South Library of 396 volumes, the Prideaux family plate of 86 pieces marked Exeter in 1789, and the further sum of £3,450 in the 3% consolidated annuities at the Bank of England. The whole in fee simple absolute, to her own sole and separate use. There was further the Wedgwood Jasperware chess set of 1796 that had stood at the South Library writing table at Prideaux Court these 28 years, and the Philidor 1749 first edition that had stood beside it. Mrs. Honoria had not come over to Exeter in Francis's lifetime. She had corresponded with the late Reverend Hadrian Prideaux at the 4 quarter days of the year since her own marriage to Sir Theodore Prideaux, the 3rd Baronet in 1791. She had had at every Lady Day return from 1815 onward an account of Francis's chess correspondence with Mr. Lewis at the chess room at St. James's Street and with Mr. Sarrett at Vauxhall Bridge Road, that she had known of the Greencalf chess journals at the Parsonage South Parlour. Francis had not known until the present hour. That she had set the Jasperware chess set and the Philidor 1749 first edition aside at the South Library writing table at Prideaux Court for Francis by name. Francis had not known until the present hour. She sat at the parlour table a long Devon while. Mrs. Honoria had been the elder sister of the late Reverend Hadrian's father, the late Mr. Lucius Prideaux of Tiverton. She had married Sir Theodore Prideaux of Prideaux Court at the parish church of Prideaux Magna in the warm summer of 1791, and had been at Prideaux Court these 28 years without coming over to Exeter. Francis's own father had been at the curacy at St. Petrock's since the autumn of 1798, and had died at the parsonage in the early spring of 1817 in his 60th year, having outlived Mrs. Cassandra Prideaux, his wife, by 7 years. Mrs. Honoria had been at the quarter-day correspondence with the Reverend Hadrian throughout, but she had not come over the 5 miles northwest from Prideaux Magna to Exeter in any year between 1791 and the present month. The reason of this, Mr. Polwell's letter did not set out, and Francis at the parlour table did not now press the question. She drew the chess journal across the table and set Mr. Sarrett's move firmly into the page she had been writing at the morning start. The green calf cover stood open beside Mr. Polwell's letter, and the Philidor first edition and the entry of the King's Gambit, accepted at move 14, stood in her even script, as it had stood earlier. She wrote no note of Mr. Polwell's letter into the chess journal. The chess journal was the chess journal. The Prideaux Court matter was a matter for the back parlour writing desk, and the careful copying of a fair-hand reply to the solicitor's chambers at Cathedral Yard. She had her father's habit of keeping the matters of the parsonage at their settled separate desks. She set the chess journal aside, drew a sheet of letter paper from the parlour desk, and wrote at the head of the sheet the date in her even hand. Saturday, 20th November 1819, Parsonage of St. Petrock's of Exeter. Below the date she wrote to Mr. Sarrett at Vauxhall Bridge Road, in the careful chess correspondence hand she kept for the London chess room. Sir, the 14th move at my hand is the Queen's pawn to my Queen's 4th, the central counter at the Philidorian manner, the knight at KB3 retained against the Italian sacrifice at KB7. Francis Prideaux. She folded the letter, addressed it to Mr. Jacob Sarrett at his Vauxhall Bridge Road address, set the parsonage wax to it, and laid it upon the parlour table to go down to the afternoon Exeter post. The afternoon Exeter post would carry the letter on the London road by Sherborne and Salisbury and Andover, and would set Mr. Sarrett's answer back at the parsonage on the Friday following at the earliest. Frances did not now press for the answer. The position upon the board was a position she had read at Philidor for 3 days past, and the central counter would hold whatever Mr. Sarrett at Vauxhall Bridge Road should set out at his 15th move. She turned then to the matter of Mr. Polwheel's letter. The Sunday following was no day to be writing to the solicitor's chambers, the parsonage observing the Sabbath at the careful Devon manner her father had set. She would write to Mr. Polwheel on the Sunday after evening prayer, and the letter would go down to Cathedral Yard with the Monday morning porter. She set the matter at the back parlour writing desk and turned her hand to the small house affairs of the Saturday. The Sunday came over the Exe in a soft, pale grey rain that ran the slate roofs of the close. Frances went down to the cathedral for the morning office, and again at evening prayer. She came back to the parsonage in the level Devon dusk, and sat at the back parlour writing desk by the south wall, and drew the parsonage letter paper across the desk, and set out her fair hand reply to Mr. Polwheel of Cathedral Yard. She wrote that she received with settled gratitude the account of her late great-aunt's bequest at his hand, that she would set the parsonage matters in order as the early week should permit, and that she would come over to the south porch of Prideaux Court on the Tuesday morning of the 30th of November, the Sabbath barring the Saturday Mr. Polwheel had named, and his note having left the porch open to her own convenience. She begged him to send word to Mrs. Carew at the housekeeper's keys, and to Mr. Champernowne at the home farm, and to Mr. Trembath at the south porch, that they might be at their settled places. She signed the letter, Frances Prideaux, Parsonage of St. Petrox of Exeter, Sunday the 21st November 1819, set the parsonage wax to it, and laid it at the back parlour table for the Monday morning porter to carry down to Cathedral Yard. The week that followed was a sensible week of packing at the parsonage. Frances had at the parsonage the small parlour furniture her father and mother had brought from her grandfather's house at Tiverton in 1798, and the Prideaux books her father had set into the back parlour over 40 years of his curacy. The heavier furniture would stand at the parsonage at Mrs. Trembath, the housekeeper's hand, and not go over to Prideaux Magna, and the lighter Frances would carry over by the Tuesday post-chaise. She packed at the parsonage from the Monday morning through the Wednesday evening at the settled pace she had learned at her father's hand. Her own personal effects went into the small leather trunk her father had given her at her 21st year, the plain morning gabardines, the cream lawn underthings, the dark Devon wool shawl, the half-mourning grey muslin she would not yet wear, the plain dark caps, her father's Greek Testament, her mother's prayer book, the small octavo Philidor 1749 first edition her father had given her, and the green calf chest journals. These went into the second trunk, a plain wooden chest with brass corners. The 3 octavo chest notebooks of analytical notes she had kept since 1815, Volume 1 of Philidor's Analyse and Surratt's Treatise at the openings, Volume 2 at the Italian game and the Ruy Lopez, Volume 3 at the King's Gambit and the Lewis Correspondence. She wrapped first in cream linen, one at a time, the cream linen folded twice over the green calf covers, and laid the 3 side by side at the bottom of the wooden chest, where no other matter should press upon them, in the journey of 5 miles northwest to Prideaux Magna. Above the notebooks, she set the small Philidor 1749 first edition, wrapped in a second cream linen, and above the Philidor, a folded copy of Mr. Sarrat's 1808 Treatise in 2 octavo volumes. The boxwood and ebony chess pieces went into a small fitted box at the top of the chest, the mahogany board behind it. The heavier matter at the south parlour she set into the third trunk, along with her father's writing desk. The matter of the parsonage took her through the Monday, the Tuesday, and the Wednesday, at the even pace she had set herself at the Sunday evening. On the Wednesday evening, she was at the back parlour by lamplight, when the postboy came up with the Friday letter from Mr. Sarrett of Vauxhall Bridge Road, the answer to the Saturday move. Mr. Sarrett had taken the central counter at the King's Pawn, PXP, as Philidor's analysis at page 91 had set out. The position upon the board stood now an open central game at move 15. Francis set the move into the green-calf chess journal at the back parlour writing desk and wrote the careful side margin. Mr. Sarrett at the central counter as Philidor set out. The open game at move 15. My 15th move shall be the knight to QB3, supporting the central pawn at K4. She set the 15th move into a letter to Vauxhall Bridge Road and laid it at the back parlour table for the Thursday morning post. The Saturday of the 27th of November came over the X in the soft pale grey of the month. Francis was at the back parlour writing desk when Mrs. Trembath came up to say that the Reverend Penberthy of the parsonage curacy had called at the south door. He was the curate her father's chapter had appointed after the Reverend Hadrian's death, and Francis had known him since the Lent of 1817. She received him in the south parlour. He took his parish leave with a sensible Devon bow and a settled blessing at the parsonage door. Francis saw him out at the south door, came back to the south parlour, and closed the lid of the wooden chest at the back parlour table for the journey of the Tuesday morning following. The Sunday of the 28th and the Monday of the 29th she kept at the parsonage in the careful, settled manner she had set herself, the parsonage in its settled order, the trunks in the south porch corridor against the Tuesday morning. The Reverend Penberthy preached at the cathedral evening office at the third Sunday of Advent, and Francis came back to the parsonage in the level Devon dusk. The Tuesday morning of the 30th of November dawned in the soft, pale grey of an early Devon winter. The post-chaise that Mr. Polwale had sent up from Exeter stood at the south door of the parsonage. Francis came down in her plain dark morning gabardine and her dark Devon wool shawl with the green calf chess journal at her hand and the plain dark morning cap at her hair. She saw the trunk set into the chaise, the small leather trunk first, the wooden chest with the cream linen-wrapped chess notebooks at its bottom second, the third trunk with the writing desk last. And she gave Mrs. Trembath the parsonage keys and the housekeeper's quarter-day wage, and the careful settled instructions she had set out at the back parlour the evening before. Francis took her seat in the chaise, and the chaise drew out of the parsonage south door and turned west by the lower side of the close, toward the Exeter Bridge and the 5-mile Devon road to Prideaux Magna. The Exeter ran high under the bridge. The chaise crossed the bridge and took the level road west. On the soft, pale grey Devon Tuesday morning of the 30th of November, in the year 1819, 10 days after Mr. Polwale the Exeter solicitor had set out at his cathedral yard chambers, the warm settled provisions of the last will and testament of the late Mrs. Honoria Prideaux of Prideaux Court in the parish of Prideaux Magna, 5 miles northwest of Exeter. The small hired post-chaise of Mr. Polwale drew up at the soft south wicket of the St. Petrox parsonage at Exeter to convey Miss Frances Prideaux, the 5 miles northwest, to Prideaux Court along the Crediton Lane, and Frances, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, for her late great-aunt the testatrix, with her plain dark mourning cap, at the soft dark hair, plaited at the nape, and the 3 completed octavo chess notebooks of 1815 to 1819, wrapped in cream linen at the careful right hand of her plain travelling case, and the small brass ring of 7 Prideaux house keys at her plain reticule, and the small folded covering letter of Mr. Polwale at her plain pocket-book, stepped up into the chaise with the settled gravity of the Exeter parsonage. Her late father, the Reverend Hadrian Prideaux, had kept at the curacy of St. Petrox of Exeter all his days, and the chaise rolled gently out of the parsonage gate along the northwestern Devon lane in the soft pale grey light of late November, past the small Devon cob and thatch cottages of the Exeter parish, and past the gentle red-ploughed acres of the Exe valley, where the November-winter wheat showed at the furrow in narrow green stripes, and at the second mile drew up briefly at the small Devon wayside inn, the Stag at Crediton, kept by Mr. and Mrs. Polwell Champernowne these 29 years past, for the post-boy to water the pair, where Francis at the small parlour window took a small plain cup of soft Devon parish tea at the gentle quiet of the cool Devon morning, and looked northwest along the Crediton lane toward the gentle slope above the Exe valley, where the slate roofs of Prideaux Court stood at the rim of the brown winter pasture. And at the gentle close of the brief halt, the chaise rolled on the further 3 miles northwest through the small Devon village of Newton St. Sire's, and along the gentle ridge of the Exe, and at the bend of the lane, drew up at last at the south porch of Prideaux Court in the soft, pale grey Devon afternoon light. The south porch of Prideaux Court stood under the plain stone-mullioned south windows of the Devon cob and thatch manor of the year 1747, slate-roofed at the rebuild of 1798, in the Prideaux settled fashion. 2 stories of pale Devon cob, with the slate dressings at the quoins and the pale slate roof, at the gentle Devon pitch, and the 3 brick chimneys at the level Devon ridge, and on the worn stone step of the south porch, Mr. Trembath, the butler of 28 years' service, stood in plain black tailcoat, with the small brass house keys at the hip and the plain folded receiving tray at the right hand. Mr. Trembath, 58, plain black tailcoat at the plain linen at the throat, inclined gravely in the level Devon butler's manner, and said in the settled Devon fashion that the house of Prideaux Court was at Miss Prideaux's warm wish. Behind him in the cool flagged south hall stood Mrs. Carew, the housekeeper of 23 years' service, in plain plum bombazine, with the small lace cap at the level Devon fashion, and the small brass household keys at her plain housekeeper's chatelaine, 55, plum bombazine at the lace cap, and Mrs. Carew curtsied at the settled Devon housekeeper's fashion, and said in the soft Devon manner that the small south chamber of the late Mrs. Honoria had been aired these 4 days past for Miss Prideaux's coming. At Mrs. Carew's right hand stood Mr. Champernowne, the steward of 19 years' service, 60, weathered, plain dark coat with the small steward's day-book at the right pocket, and Mr. Champernowne bowed in the level Devon steward's manner, and said in the plain Devon fashion that the home pasture and the walled south garden and the apple orchard stood at Miss Prideaux's settled wish. Mr. Polwell, who had ridden over from Exeter by the shorter Crediton lane to meet the chaise at the south porch, produced from his plain dark wool pocket-book the folded inventory at the green ribbon at the South Hall writing table beside the brass standish, and the inventory of the Prideaux estate, of the late Mrs. Honoria Prideaux, widow, of the late Sir Theodore Prideaux, 3rd Baronet, and lately of Prideaux Court, set out at the careful italic of Mr. Polwell's clerk, Mr. Polwell Champernowne, comprised the home pasture and the walled south garden of 1/2 acre, and the apple orchard of the small Devon cider apples at the east of 166 acres of the gentle Devon slope above the Exe valley, the south library at the lower floor of the manor of 396 volumes, principally classical and historical, at the plain Devon calf shelves of the late Sir Theodore's gentle settled gathering, the Prideaux family plate of 86 pieces marked Exeter 1789, by the Exeter platemaker, Mr. Trembath Polwell, at the small plate-room at the south kitchen passage, and the further sum of £3,450 in the 3% consolidated annuities at the Bank of England, standing in the late Mrs. Honoria's name at the testatrix's death. These comprised the whole of the real and personal estate at the south porch of Prideaux Court, at the soft, pale grey Devon afternoon of the 30th of November. From the gentle Devon slope, at the south windows of the lower floor, the Exe Valley lay below, at the soft November fall of the land, in narrow ploughed red stripes, and the small clear silver Exe ran quiet south through the willow-set south meadow toward the small parish of Bramford Speke and the broader Exe estuary at Topsham, and beyond the gentle Devon pasture to the west, the high grey-blue rim of Dartmoor rose at the soft horizon under the pale grey, late November Devon sky. The small pale rooks turning at the soft wind off the moor above the gentle home pasture. And at the gentle east turn of the slope, the small slate roofs of Prideaux Magna village lay below, at the lane in the warm, Devon grey slate of the village under the gentle smoke of the village hearths. The small Devon sandstone tower of St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna, rising plain and square, at the village centre, beside the gentle Devon lane. Frances, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, walked at Mrs. Carew's quiet right hand at the gentle late November afternoon light, along the cool flagged south hall to the south library at the lower floor, and at the plain writing table at the south window of the south library she found set out in the careful, settled fashion of the late great-aunt, the small Wedgwood jasperware chess set of the year 1796, in the gentle pale blue and white jasper of the small Staffordshire pattern at the small inlaid Devon cherry wood chessboard beside the worn calf Philidor of 1749, in the patient first edition of the Analyse du jeu des échecs, at the patient settled hand of the late Sir Theodore's Lincoln's Inn gathering, and Frances at the South Library writing table took up the small worn calf Philidor at her plain right hand in the gentle quiet of the cool afternoon, and read at the careful settled spine the patient Paris hand of the publisher Moutard at the gentle settled Devon fashion of the late great-aunt's 28 years at the South Library. At the soft fall of the early Devon evening, Mrs. Carew brought up at the small plain Devon salver the small worn green calf chess journal of the late Mrs. Honoria Prideaux, of the 28 years' correspondence, games at the patient, settled Devon hand from the first page at the spring of 1791, at the late Sir Theodore's wedding gift to her at the last page at the cool November of 1819, 7 days before the testatrix's death, and laid the small green calf chess journal gentle on the plain South Library writing table at Miss Prideaux's settled hand beside the small Wedgwood jasperware chess set of 1796 and the worn calf Philidor of 1749. Frances, in the settled Devon composure, took up the small green calf chess journal at the gentle quiet of the early winter evening, and read the patient settled hand of her late great-aunt at the first page of the spring of 1791, the small, careful Italian game at the late Sir Theodore's hand at the white side, and the late Mrs. Honoria's careful Ruy Lopez at the black, at the small drawing-room chessboard at the south parlour of Prideaux Court, and laid the small green calf chess journal gentle at the right hand of the worn calf Philidor at the plain South Library writing table, and the small coal fire at the South Library grate burned quiet at the gentle settled Devon fashion at the soft fall of the early winter light. Mrs. Carew at the doorway of the South Library inclined gravely in the plum bombazine manner, and said in the soft Devon fashion that the small south chamber of the late Mrs. Honoria stood ready at Miss Prideaux's settled wish, and Frances at the South Library writing table acquiesced at the gentle Devon fashion her late father had kept at the curacy of St. Petrox of Exeter. On the soft Devon Wednesday morning of the 1st of December, Frances, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, walked at Mrs. Carew's quiet right hand the small round of the south kitchen wall, and the walled south garden and the apple orchard at the gentle fall of the soft December land, and at the apple orchard, Mr. Champernowne, at her right hand, pointed out in the patient Devon steward's fashion the settled rows of the late Sir Theodore's apple trees at the walled east corner and the thin grey willow at the south wall of the orchard above the X, and named the small Devon tenants of the Prideaux estate, Mr. Coleridge Polwale at the Western Pasture Cottage, and Mr. Trembath Carew at the Eastern Lower Meadow Cottage, and Mr. Russell Pole at the village forge at Prideaux Magna, and said in the patient Devon steward's manner that each tenant had stood at the small rent roll of the late Mrs. Honoria at the Lady Day quarter, and the Michaelmas quarter for the 4 years past at the late great-aunt's settled wish. On the soft Devon Wednesday afternoon, Francis at the South Library writing table opened the worn calf Philidor of 1749 at the careful right hand of the soft afternoon light, and worked patient through the gentle settled bibliography of the late great-aunt's chess reading, the Paris Moutard, first edition of the Analyse du jeu des échecs, at the annotated King's Gambit pages, the London first edition of the Sarat Treatise on the Game of Chess of 1808, the small octavo Greco analysis of 1620 on the Italian game at the late Sir Theodore's Lincoln's Inn Hand, and the folio facsimile of the Ruy Lopez, Libro de la Invención Liberal y Arte del Juego del Ajedrez of 1561, at the late Mrs. Honoria's Paris-purchased copy of the spring of 1793, and made small notes at the plain octavo field book she had brought from the Exeter parsonage in her travelling case. The patient hand of her late great-aunt at the marginal notes of each volume stood at the settled Devon fashion at the soft fall of the December afternoon light. On the soft Devon Thursday morning of the 2nd of December, Mrs. Carew brought up at the small Devon salver the parish tea at the gentle settled fashion, and laid the cup at the right hand of the South Library writing table, beside the worn calf Philidor and the green calf chess journal, and Francis at the gentle Devon composure took the cup at the quiet of the South Library and looked at the south window above the Exe valley. The thin grey willows at the south meadow stood quiet at the soft wind off the western Dartmoor rim, and the clear silver Exe ran south at the gentle November water at the lower meadow. On the soft Devon Friday morning of the 3rd of December, Mr. Polwale rode over from Exeter by the Crediton Lane, and sat with Miss Prideaux at the soft South Library, and read at the plain gold-rimmed spectacles in the patient Exeter solicitor's fashion the careful hand of her late great-aunt at the green calf chess journal, and said in the plain Devon manner that the journal stood at the settled fashion of the late Mrs. Honoria's Devon wish, beside the Wedgwood Jasperware chess set of 1796 and the worn calf Philidor of 1749. On the soft Devon Saturday afternoon of the 4th of December, the 5th day of Francis's residence at Prideaux Court, a small plain post-chaise drew up at the south porch, and a thin plain Devon clerk in plain charcoal wool, with the plain leather folded pocket-book at the right hand, stepped down at the south step, and presented at Mr. Trembath's small folded receiving tray a single plain Plymouth printed calling card of cream pasteboard at the plain copperplate engraving, Sir Hubert Pole, 4th Baronet, Pole Hall, near Plymouth, together with a small folded note in plain charcoal ink at the plain Devon hand of Sir Hubert's clerk, and the clerk, Mr. Pole Russell, thin grey, plain charcoal wool, said in the plain Devon clerk's manner that he stood at his master's instruction to leave at the south door of Prideaux Court the preliminary calling card and the folded note announcing that Sir Hubert Pole of Pole Hall, near Plymouth, desired the favour of a private interview with Miss Prideaux at the South Library of Prideaux Court on the Wednesday following at Sir Hubert's settled convenience. Mr. Trembath received the card and the folded note at the small folded receiving tray in the level Devon butler's fashion, and bowed gravely, and carried them up the cool flagged south hall to the South Library, where Francis sat at the plain South Library writing table with the worn calf Philidor of 1749, opened at the patient King's Gambit pages, and the small green calf chest journal of the late Mrs. Honoria. At her plain right hand at the gentle quiet of the soft afternoon, and Mr. Trembath presented the small folded receiving tray at her plain right hand in the level Devon butler's manner. Frances, in the even Devon composure, took up the plain cream pasteboard calling card and read the plain copperplate engraving in the level Devon fashion and laid the card flat on the plain South Library writing table beside the worn calf Philidor, then took up the small folded charcoal ink note and read the plain Devon hand of Sir Hubert's clerk in the gentle quiet of the soft afternoon, and laid the note flat at the right hand of the card, and said in the plain, even Devon fashion to Mr. Trembath that the matter should be forwarded at the evening, Devon post, to Mr. Polwell at the Cathedral Yard Chambers at Exeter for his settled counsel. Mr. Trembath inclined gravely in the level Devon butler's manner and withdrew, and Frances at the South Library writing table took up the plain quill and a clean sheet of plain Devon laid paper, and wrote at the level Devon hand a small folded covering note to Mr. Polwell at Cathedral Yard at Exeter, enclosing the calling card of Sir Hubert Pole and the folded charcoal ink note of Mr. Pole Russell, and stating that she should be glad of Mr. Polwell's settled counsel before the Wednesday following, and sealed the folded packet in plain Prideaux crimson wax with the small plain Prideaux signet at her late father's gentle settled fashion, and laid the packet on the small South Hall salver for the evening Devon postboy, who at the gentle close of the soft November afternoon took it up at the south porch and rode southeast the 5 miles to Exeter at the level Devon pace. On the soft Devon Sunday morning of the 5th of December, the first Sunday of Frances's residence at Prideaux Court and the second Sunday of Advent in the parish of Prideaux Magna, Frances, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, walked at Mrs. Carew's quiet right hand the small quarter-mile down the soft Devon lane from the south porch of Prideaux Court to the small Devon sandstone tower of St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna at the village centre, and sat in the plain Prideaux south pew at the second bay, from the chancel in the level Devon Prideaux fashion her late great-aunt had kept the 28 years of her Devon residence, and Reverend Coleridge of 49 years, in plain black gown at the small Devon sandstone pulpit, preached the Advent 2 sermon at the gentle Devon text of the prophet Isaiah at the 11th chapter, "And a little child shall lead them." In the patient, settled Devon pastoral fashion he had kept at the cure of Prideaux Magna these 9 years past, and Frances at the gentle Devon composure heard the Advent sermon at the second bay from the chancel, and at the gentle close of the service walked back at Mrs. Carew's quiet right hand the small quarter-mile up the soft Devon lane to the south porch of Prideaux Court in the soft pale grey December Devon light. That afternoon at the soft South Library at Prideaux Court, Frances sat at the plain Devon writing table with the small green calf chest journal of the late Mrs. Honoria, opened at the careful settled hand of the spring of 1791, and worked patient through the 28 years of the late great-aunt's correspondence games, the Italian game entries of 1791 at the late Sir Theodore's hand at the South Parlour chessboard, the Ruy Lopez entries of 1796 at the Wedgwood Jasperware chess sets first winter, the King's Gambit entries of 1804 at the late great-aunt's settled Philidor reading, the Sarrat entries of 1808 at the London edition's first arrival at the South Library shelf, the Greco entries of 1812 at the Italian game pages of the Lincoln's Inn gathering, and at last, the settled Devon entries of 1815-1819 at the gentle Lewis and Sarrat correspondence. The pages turned patient at Frances's even Devon hand at the gentle quiet of the December afternoon, and Mrs. Carew brought up the small Devon parish tea at the plain salver, and set it gentle at the right hand of the writing table. At the gentle close of the soft Devon Sunday afternoon, Frances at the even Devon composure took the small cup at the soft quiet of the South Library, and turned at the gentle Devon fashion her late father had kept, at the courtesy the matter of the Wednesday following, at Sir Hubert Pole's settled convenience, and the Wedgwood Jasperware chess set of 1796, and the worn calf Philidor of 1749, and the green calf chess journal of the 8 years correspondence games, lay open at her plain right hand at the soft fall of the early December, Devon evening. The pale Devon. Wednesday morning of the 8th of December, 1819 came in over the south slope of Prideaux Court, the colour of pewter under a thin December cloud, with the Exe running quiet at the south meadow, and the apple orchard at the east standing leafless under a soft, hard rime. Frances Prideaux had risen early at the south chamber, had taken her plain Devon breakfast at the south parlour, and had gone through to the south library by the long stone-flagged passage in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, for her late great-aunt the testatrix, with her plaited dark hair gathered at the nape under a plain dark mourning cap, and with the considered Devon gravity that her late father, the Reverend Hadrian Prideaux, had bred into her at the Exeter parsonage these 28 years past. She had at the South Library writing table laid out, in the order in which she meant to take them up, 3 articles by which she meant to meet Sir Hubert Pole at the appointed hour. She had laid out, first, her own analytical octavo notebook, third in plain green calf, opened at the page on which her chess correspondence with Mr. William Lewis of the St. James's Street chess room at London ran through the autumn of 1818 and the spring of 1819, with the dates entered at the head of each entry in her own neat brown ink in the round small hand her late father had set her at the parsonage schoolroom. She had laid out, second, in a thin morocco wallet at her right hand, a letter from Mr. Lewis himself, written from his rooms at St. James's Street, and dated the 14th of May, 1820, in which Mr. Lewis had given her the plain print history of the book that Sir Hubert was to come and quote at her. She had laid out, third, at the inner edge of the writing table, the small octavo trade list of Messrs. J. Hatchard at 173 Piccadilly, London, for the publishing year, 1822, in plain printed wrappers, on which the book in question stood entered as item 47 of that year's new publications. She had set out the 3 articles in a small, careful row at the south end of the writing table, with a clean leaf of foolscap and her plain steel pen at her right hand. She had drawn the green-shaded reading lamp to the inner edge. She had drawn the south library curtain back at the long, stone-mullioned window above the X, so that the soft, pale Devon light came in at a long angle from the south. She had thought it best to meet the matter at the South Library, because it was the very room at which Sir Hubert proposed to set his claim, and because it was the very room at which her late great-aunt Mrs. Honoria Prideaux had kept her own green calf chess journal of correspondence games these 28 years past, and because the South Library held the Wedgwood Jasperware chess set of 1796 and the Philidor 1749 first edition that had stood at this same writing table from her late great-aunt's marriage to Sir Theodore Prideaux in 1791 to her death on the 16th of November last. She had rung for Mrs. Carew, the housekeeper, who had come up in her plain plum bombazine and lace cap, and had taken her instructions for the morning in 3 plain sentences. Mr. Polwale, the Exeter solicitor, was to be brought up at the South Library on his arrival from his chambers at Cathedral Yard, Exeter, by the Crediton Road. The Reverend Coleridge, the Prideaux parish curate, was to be brought up at the South Library on his coming over from the parsonage at Prideaux Magna by the home pasture lane. Sir Hubert Pole and his barrister, Mr. Russell, were to be received at the south porch by Mr. Trembath, the Prideaux butler, and brought through by the long passage to the South Library, at the door of which Mr. Trembath was to announce them in the plain Devon form. Mrs. Carew had set the 3 coverings of the writing-table chairs, had brought up the plain Devon tea-tray, in the back hall against the matter at hand, and had set the small Wedgwood jasperware chess pieces in their plain mahogany case at the inner shelf of the writing table, so that they should stand at view through the morning. She had sent Mr. Champernowne, the Prideaux steward, out at the home pasture to keep his round at the south slope and to come up for the closing of the matter, and she had sent the backstairs maid, Sarah Pengelly, down to the lower passage with the message that the south library door was not to be opened at any party excepting at her own ring, or at Mr. Trembath's announce. Frances Prideaux, at 28, had then taken the south library writing table chair, had drawn her 3 articles a small careful inch toward her, had drawn from the inner drawer her own plain pewter inkwell and her plain steel pen, and had at the green-shaded reading lamp written out at the head of the foolscap leaf, in her own neat brown ink in her round small hand, the 3 plain matters that Sir Hubert Pole's calling card dropped on Saturday the 4th of December had proposed for the present interview. She had written the date at the head. Wednesday, 8th December, 1819. South Library, Prideaux Court, Prideaux Magna, Devon. And beneath the date, the 3 plain matters. First, the claim of a parole trust said to have been settled at the South Library writing table in September 1818. Second, the discussion said to have been heard at the South Library in connection with William Lewis's Elements of the Game of Chess on the 14th of September 1818. Third, the publication date of the same Elements, on which the whole matter turned. She had then heard the soft Devon trot of Mr. Polwell's Crediton hack at the South Carriage Sweep. Mr. Polwell had come up by the long, stone-flagged passage in his plain dark wool and his gold spectacles, had laid his small portmanteau of papers on the writing-table at her left hand, and had taken the writing-table chair at her right, with the small, dry Exeter nod that he had given her at the Cathedral Yard Chambers on the 20th of November last. He had been joined by the Reverend Coleridge in his plain black gown, coming over by the home pasture lane from the Prideaux Magna parsonage, with his small Greek Testament in his coat pocket and the long Cambridge stoop at his shoulder. The Reverend Coleridge had taken his stand at the South Library window above the X, and had said in 3 plain words that he was at Miss Prideaux's disposal until the matter was concluded. Mr. Polwell had drawn from his portmanteau the plain copy of Sir Hubert's calling card, and the folded note dropped at the south door by his clerk, Mr. Paul Russell, on Saturday the 4th of December, on which Sir Hubert had announced the present interview for Wednesday the 8th, the matter at hand being a settled understanding with the late Mrs. Honoria Prideaux as to half the Prideaux estate. He had drawn out also the plain copy of the late Mrs. Honoria's last will and testament admitted to probate at the Prerogative Court at Exeter on Saturday the 20th of November last, on which the whole of the real and personal estate stood devised to Frances Prideaux, the only surviving child of the late curate of St. Petrox of Exeter, in fee simple absolute, to her own sole and separate use. Frances, at the writing table, had set her hand on her own green calf notebook the 3rd at the Lewis correspondence page, and had said in the plain Devon way that Mr. Polwell and the Reverend Coleridge were to hear at her hand the 3 articles she had set out, and that she would, at the proper moment of the interview, take them up in the order at which they stood at the writing table. Mr. Polwell had said, "Madame, I am at your disposal," in the small, dry Exeter form. The Reverend Coleridge had said, "Miss Prideaux," in his soft, long Cambridge tone. The soft, pale Devon morning, at the long, stone-mullioned window, had stood at the threshold of the hour. Mr. Trembath, the Prideaux butler, at the south porch at 11, precisely announced Sir Hubert Pole, B.T., and Mr. Russell of the Inner Temple. Sir Hubert Pole, 56, stout 5'10", gout-flushed, primrose silk waistcoat, oily smile. Mr. Russell the barrister, thin grey, charcoal wool, plain black portmanteau. They had come up by the long stone-flagged passage with the heavy Devon tread of a man at his own claim. and had been brought through at the South Library door by Mr. Trembath in the plain Devon form. Sir Hubert had bowed at the writing table with the small set bow of the West Country baronet at a kinswoman's threshold, had taken the chair set out for him on the south side of the writing table, and had drawn a small worked snuff-box from his waistcoat in the smooth West Country way that Mr. Polwell in his small dry Exeter form did not return. Sir Hubert had then opened with a short, prefatory sentence by which he gave his condolences upon the death of the late Mrs. Honoria Prideaux, his cousin twice removed, who had, at Prideaux Court, these 28 years, kept her own correspondence with Pole Hall, near Plymouth, at the quarter-days, and a further sentence by which he begged the present interview would be conducted at the private Devon footing on which he held it to belong. Mr. Russell had drawn out a small leather folio of papers and had set them at the south side of the writing-table in 3 plain piles, while Mr. Polwell at Francis's right had set down 2 plain notes on his foolscap. Sir Hubert had then come at his claim. He had told Francis Prideaux and Mr. Polwell and the Reverend Coleridge that he had, on the Wednesday afternoon of the 14th of September 1818, called at Prideaux Court at the express invitation of the late Mrs. Honoria, Prideaux his cousin, twice removed, on a matter of family settlement, and that he had at the South Library writing-table held a private interview at which the late Mrs. Honoria had, by spoken words at the writing-table, settled upon him a parole trust over half of Prideaux Court, the home pasture, the South Library, the apple orchard, and the Exay meadow, on the understanding that he would at her death come over from Pole Hall and undertake the management of the estate at the agreed half-share. He had said that she had set her hand to the matter in plain words, that she had repeated the substance of the settlement in his hearing in 3 plain sentences, and that the whole matter had passed at the South Library writing-table on the 14th of September, 1818, at the considered word of a Prideaux of Prideaux Court. He had then come at the corroborating matter on which his case turned. He had said that the late Mrs. Honoria, on that same 14th of September 1818, had at the writing-table opened a small octavo volume in plain boards and had discussed the said parole trust in connection with William Lewis's Elements of the Game of Chess, which she had lately read at the South Library on the Wednesday afternoon of the 14th of September 1818. He had said that she had held the Elements open at a certain page on the King's Gambit, had read out a passage at the reading lamp, and had remarked at his hearing that the matter at hand was settled at her own Devon judgment in the manner of the King's Gambit. He had said that he held the Elements and the discussion at the South Library as the corroborating fact upon which his parole trust was to be settled, and that he held himself ready to be examined on every plain particular. Mr. Russell had drawn a single sheet from his small leather folio and had laid it at the south side of the writing-table, which he had said was his note of Sir Hubert's instructions at the Inner Temple on the matter of the Elements and the South Library, and at which he had said the present interview should be considered on the plain footing of a settled family understanding between cousins twice removed. Mr. Polwell had set down a small dry Exeter note in plain pencil, and had at his small dry Exeter nod begged that Miss Prideaux be heard at her own 3 articles, which she had set out at the south end of the table that very morning. Francis Prideaux at the writing-table chair had then, in the plain Devon way that her late father at the Exeter parsonage had bred into her these 28 years past, set her hand on the first of the 3 articles she had laid out, being her own analytical octavo notebook, the 3rd in plain green calf, and had drawn it across the writing-table at her own right hand. She had opened it at the Lewis correspondence page, on which the dates of her correspondence with Mr. William Lewis at the St. James's Street chess room ran in her own neat brown ink in the round small hand from October 1817 to June 1819 at her own care. She had drawn the green-shaded reading lamp a careful inch toward the page, so that the soft, pale Devon light at the long, stone-mullioned window above the X and the lamp together gave Sir Hubert Pole a plain view of the entries, and she had said in the plain Devon way that she would, before she turned to the article in her hand, give Sir Hubert one plain matter of print history on which the whole of the present interview was to be set. Sir Hubert, she had said, Mr. Lewis's Elements of the Game of Chess was not published until 1822. It was not in print, in proof, or in private circulation in September 1818. The book did not yet exist at the date you set out. The matter cannot have been at the table you set it out. Sir Hubert Pole, at the south side of the writing table, had paused in the small-set Devon way of a man at his own claim caught at the threshold. He had set down the small worked snuff-box at the writing-table edge, had laid his stout right hand at the writing-table beside his note, and had at the gout-flushed cheek shown a soft Devon red that had not been at the writing-table at his coming up the long, stone-flagged passage. Mr. Russell at his left hand had paused at the single sheet, had set the corner at his thin grey finger, and had at the writing-table looked at Mr. Polwell in the manner of the Inner Temple at the threshold of a matter at which he had not been instructed. Frances Prideaux, at the writing-table, had then taken up the first article. She had at the Lewis correspondence page of her own analytical octavo notebook, Thread turned to the entry of the 7th of January 1819, on which she had at the South Parsonage of St. Petrox of Exeter set down her first inquiry to Mr. Lewis at the St. James's Street chess room as to the printed treatise on the game of chess that Mr. Lewis had at his shop the previous summer announced as in preparation. She had at the same page turned to the entry of the 3rd of March 1819, on which she had received Mr. Lewis's first reply that the said treatise was in slow preparation at his hand and would be put to press in the course of 1821 for an early 1822 publication at the printing house of Mr. J. Hatchard at 173 Piccadilly in London. She had turned at the same page to the entry of the 14th of May 1820, on which she had received Mr. Lewis's second reply at the South Library of Prideaux Court, with the plain print history that she had laid out at the writing-table that morning in the small morocco wallet at her right hand. She had, at the same page, laid open the entry beside the writing-table reading lamp, so that Mr. Polwell at her right, and the Reverend Coleridge at the South Library window, above the Exeter and Sir Hubert Pole, at the south side of the writing-table, and Mr. Russell at his left hand, might all read at the soft, pale Devon morning light, the plain brown ink in her round, small hand. She had said, "The first announcement to me of the book at Mr. Lewis's hand is dated the 7th of January, 1819. The first answer to me of the printing arrangement at Mr. Hatchard's hand at Piccadilly is dated the 3rd of March, 1819. The first specific notice of the press date and the publication date is dated the 14th of May, 1820. There is at the dates of my own analytical notebook 3 no entry, in October 1817, or in the autumn of 1818, or in the spring of 1819, by which the book at Sir Hubert's table can have been at the South Library writing table on the Wednesday afternoon of the 14th of September, 1818. She had then taken up the second article. She had at the small morocco wallet at her right hand drawn out the letter of Mr. William Lewis himself, dated from his rooms at the St. James's Street chess room on the 14th of May, 1820, on which Mr. Lewis had given her the plain print history of elements of the game of chess at his own hand on the day on which he had laid it down. She had, at the writing-table, laid open the letter so that Mr. Polwell and the Reverend Coleridge and Sir Hubert Pole and Mr. Russell might at the writing-table read at the reading lamp the small, plain, neat London hand of Mr. Lewis at the threshold of the press arrangement on the date of the 14th of May, 1820. The letter had at its first paragraph reported that Mr. Lewis was at his rooms at St. James's Street, drawing the work to a settled close, that he meant to deliver the copy to Mr. Hatchard at Piccadilly at midsummer following, that Mr. Hatchard had undertaken to put the work to press in the autumn of 1821, that the work was to be printed in 2 octavo volumes at the Piccadilly Printing House, and that the publication day was to be set at the early part of the year 1822 at 173 Piccadilly in London. She had said, "Sir Hubert, the letter is at Mr. Lewis's plain hand on the 14th of May 1820. The press date is the autumn of 1821. The publication day is the early part of 1822. There is at the threshold of the press arrangement in May 1820 no proof, no privately printed copy, and no circulated text in 1818 by which the book can have been at the South Library writing table at the date you set out." She had then taken up the 3rd article. She had at the inner edge of the writing table drawn the small octavo trade list of Messrs. J. Hatchard at 173 Piccadilly in London for the publishing year 1822 in plain printed wrappers, on which she had, at the South Library of Prideaux Court, entered her own neat round-hand inscription that it had been received at her own subscription from Messrs. Hatchard by the Piccadilly Mail in the 2nd week of April 1822. She had, at the writing table, opened the trade list at the page on which the new publications of 1822 were entered, and had at the reading lamp pointed to the 47th entry of that year, on which stood the plain printed line, "Lewis William. Elements of the Game of Chess, in 2 octavo volumes. Hatchard, 173 Piccadilly. 2 volumes, octavo, plain boards, 21 shillings, published April the 2nd, 1822. She had said, "Sir Hubert, the trade list at Mr. Hatchard's hand is dated 1822, and the entry shows the publication day of the 2nd of April, 1822. There is at the plain printed evidence of the publisher's own trade list no possibility, at the writing table of the South Library at Prideaux Court on the 14th of September 1818, of any discussion of a book whose press arrangement was not made until the spring of 1820, and whose publication day was not until April 1822. She had then drawn the 3 articles at the south end of the writing table a careful inch towards Sir Hubert Pole, so that he might at the green-shaded reading lamp examine each at the soft, pale Devon morning light. She had set them in the order of date, the analytical notebook through at the 1817 to 1819 correspondence, the Lewis letter of 14th of May 1820, and the Hatchard trade list of April 1822. She had said in the plain, Devon way, Sir Hubert, Mr. Lewis's Elements of the Game of Chess was not published until 1822. It was not in print, in proof, or in private circulation in September 1818. The book did not yet exist at the date you set out. The matter cannot have been at the table you set it out. Mr. Russell at his left hand had at the writing table drawn his single sheet, a careful inch back, at his own thin grey finger, had at the South Library reading lamp examined the entries of Francis's notebook thware in their plain brown ink, had at the Lewis letter of the 14th of May, 1820, examined the small plain neat London hand of Mr. Lewis at the press arrangement, and had at the Hatchard trade list of April 1822 examined the 47th entry in its plain printed line. He had at the writing table reading lamp paused in the manner of the Inner Temple at the long view of 3 plain articles on which his client's case was at the South Library writing table not to be set, and he had at the small set, thin grey finger laid down at the writing table the single sheet of his note of Sir Hubert's instructions. Mr. Polwell at his gold spectacles at the right of Francis had at his own plain steel pen drawn at his fool's cap a small dry Exeter note in plain ink, by which he set down the 3 articles at the South Library writing table, in the order in which Francis had taken them up, with the dates at the head of each, and the print history of the elements of the game of chess, as evidenced at the Lewis letter of 14th May, 1820, and the Hatchard Trade List of April 1822. He had at the same plain ink set down at the foot of the foolscap the plain Exeter judgment that the claim of a parole trust at the South Library writing table on the 14th of September 1818, corroborated only by a discussion of a book that did not yet exist, was at the present interview not to be sustained at any court of the West. Sir Hubert Pole at the south side of the writing table had at the gout-flushed cheek and the primrose silk waistcoat that had carried him up the long stone-flagged passage, paused at his 3 plain articles, had at the small worked snuff-box, paused at his stout right hand, and had at the South Library reading lamp at the soft pale Devon light, at the long stone-mullioned window, above the X set down a single small west country breath. He had at the green-shaded lamp examined again the 7th of January 1819 entry of the analytical notebook, the 3rd at the Lewis correspondence page, had examined again the 14th of May 1820 letter at the Lewis hand, had examined again the 2nd of April 1822 entry at the Hatchard Trade List, and had at the South Library writing table chair set his stout right hand on the writing table edge in the small set west country way of a man at his own claim, collapsed at the threshold. He had then, in the plain west country tone that he had brought up at the south porch, said at the small set hand at the writing table edge that he had at the South Library. Writing table heard the matter at Miss Prideaux's hand, that he had at the writing table examined the 3 articles at her own setting out, and that he found at the writing table no answer at his own claim, by which he might at the present interview maintain the matter of the parole trust at the South Library on the 14th of September 1818. He had said that he would at his own present withdrawal not press the claim at the South Library writing table further, that he would at his own present withdrawal not press the matter at any subsequent interview at Prideaux Court, and that he would at his own present withdrawal at the South Porch return to Pole Hall, near Plymouth, by the Crediton Road at the afternoon coach. Mr. Russell at the writing table had at his leather folio gathered up his 3 plain piles of papers, had drawn the corner of his single sheet at his thin grey finger, and had risen at the small set thin grey way of the inner temple at the close of a matter at which he had not been instructed to expect 3 articles set out at the considered Devon hand of a great niece of the testatrix. He had inclined at Mr. Polwale in the small set inner temple way, had inclined at Miss Prideaux in the same form, and had said in 3 plain words that he would withdraw at the South Porch with his client. Mr. Polwale at his gold spectacles at the right of Francis had at the writing table set down his small dry Exeter note in plain ink, had drawn the foolscap a careful inch toward Francis, and had at the South Library reading lamp at the green shade said in the small dry Exeter way that he held the 3 articles at her own hand at the writing table, to be at every plain particular at the proof, that he held the claim of Sir Hubert Pole at the South Library on the 14th of September 1818 to be at the writing table, not to be sustained, and that he held the matter to be at the South Library writing table at the present interview at its close. He had at the same plain ink said, "Miss Prideaux, the matter is settled. The chess-book has settled it." Frances Prideaux, at 28 at the South Library writing table, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, had at her own hand drawn the 3 articles a careful inch back at the south end of the writing table. She had at the analytical octavo notebook, the 3rd, closed the Lewis correspondence page at her own brown ink. She had at the small morocco wallet at her right hand replaced the Lewis letter of the 14th of May, 1820. She had at the inner edge of the writing table replaced the Hatchard Trade List of April 1822. She had at the writing table chair risen in the plain Devon way at the close of the matter at which she had at the South Library set out the 3 articles, and she had at the South Library writing table at the South Porch given Sir Hubert Pole and Mr. Russell the plain Devon farewell at the close of the present interview. The Reverend Coleridge, at the South Library window above the X, at his soft, long Cambridge tone, had at the writing-table chair inclined at Miss Prideaux in the plain Devon way, had at the small Greek Testament in his coat pocket, said 3 plain words of the Advent 2 epistle that he had taken at St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna on the Sunday following Sir Hubert's calling card, and had at the south porch followed Mr. Polwhaley and Sir Hubert and Mr. Russell at the long stone-flagged passage at the close of the matter. The soft, pale Devon morning at the long stone-mullioned window above the Exie had passed at the close of the South Library interview, and the South Meadow at the Exe had run quiet at the slate-grey water at the close of the December day at the south slope of Prideaux Court. Mr. Trembath, the Prideaux butler at the south porch, had handed Sir Hubert Pole his caped greatcoat, and Mr. Russell his plain black portmanteau, had at the south carriage sweep at the Pole Hall hack signalled the afternoon coach at the Crediton Road, and had at the south porch closed the heavy oak door upon their withdrawal in the plain Devon way, that Mr. Champernowne, the Prideaux steward at the home pasture, had on his round at the south slope, observed at the small set, Devon nod. Mrs. Carew, the housekeeper at the back hall, had at the same hour brought up at the South Library the plain Devon tea-tray, had set it at the South Library writing-table at Mr. Polwell's right, and at the Reverend Coleridge's left, and had at the small set Devon way of the Prideaux housekeeper of 28 years standing, said in 3 plain words, "Madam, the matter is closed." Frances Prideaux, at the South Library writing-table, had at the plain Devon tea-tray taken her cup at her own hand, had at the South Library reading-lamp turned the green shade a careful inch from the writing-table, and had at the small, careful Devon way drawn her own analytical octavo notebook, third a small, careful inch toward her at the writing-table edge. She had at her own neat brown ink in her round small hand, set down at the foot of the Lewis correspondence page, the plain entry. Wednesday, 8th December, 1819. South Library, Prideaux Court. Sir Hubert Pole and Mr. Russell withdrew. Claim of parole trust at South Library writing table on the 14th of September, 1818, not sustained. Lewis. Elements of the Game of Chess, not published until 1822. The book did not yet exist at the date he set out. F.P. From the middle of December through into April, Frances Prideaux kept her quiet alternation between the Exeter parsonage at Cathedral Yard and the south porch of Prideaux Court above the X, the green calf chess journal travelling with her at every return between the Exeter parsonage and the Devon manor, the 3 octavo notebooks of Philidor and Sarrat analysis kept at the South Library writing table of Prideaux Court at the steady hand of the parish post, the correspondence game with Mr. Sarrat at his Vauxhall Bridge Road address continued at the quarter page of the Green Calf Chess Journal. The correspondence game with Mr. Lewis at his St. James's Street chess room continued at the half page of the same Green Calf Chess Journal in the gentle Devon italic she had kept since the first year of her correspondence with Mr. Lewis in 1815. The King's Gambit accepted of the autumn of 1819, finished at the 22nd move on a soft, pale grey, Devon Wednesday in early February, at the South Library writing table of Prideaux Court, with Mrs. Carew silent at the brick hob in the south kitchen, and Mr. Trembath silent at the south porch. The answer letter from Mr. Sarrat at Vauxhall Bridge Road, acknowledging the finish of the King's Gambit. Accepted, brought up at the south porch by Mr. Trembath in his plain black tailcoat at the parish post pace of a Devon February, and the new game opened at the King's Bishop's Gambit at her own move, 3 of a fresh octavo page in the same gentle Devon hand she had kept at Cathedral Yard and at Prideaux Court since 1815. Miss Tamsin Carew, 24, Mrs. Carew's niece from the Crediton side, came up as reading companion at the South Library, evenings in plain dark grey wool. The Saturday parish school class at the South Porch settled at 6 village girls: Damaris Champernowne, the steward's eldest; Letitia Coleridge, the curate's middle daughter; Hetty Trembath, the butler's niece from over at Bramford Speke; Faith Polwale, the Exeter solicitor's youngest; Sophie Carew, the housekeeper's grandniece from St Thomas's of Exeter; and Bryony Russell from the Prideaux Magna Village School. And the 6 girls came up at 10 of a Saturday morning in their plain Devon stuff gowns and plain straw bonnets, with their slates and their fresh-bound copybooks at their hands. The Saturday chess class at the South Porch had begun in the second week of January at Francis's own settled instruction, and at Reverend Coleridge's warm parish approval, the 6 village girls seated at the long oak South Porch table of Prideaux Court above the X, with the Wedgwood Jasperware chess set of 1796 set out at the centre, and Francis's 3 octavo notebooks of Philidor and Sarrat analysis at her elbow, and the great-aunt's Philidor, a 1749, first edition open at the South Porch table, the first Saturday given to the moves of the bishops alone, the diagonal sweep of the White King's bishop from F1 to A6, along the long open diagonal of the empty board, and the diagonal sweep of the Black King's bishop from F8 to A3, along the same long open diagonal of the empty board, Francis, drilling the 6 village girls at the long diagonal move, and at the short diagonal move, and at the pinning capacity of the bishop on the open diagonal against an exposed king at the back rank, until Damaris Champernowne and Letitia Coleridge could call the squares at the bishop's reach from any starting file at the empty board in the soft Devon English of a parish school Saturday, and at the second Saturday at the moves of the king's bishop in the development from F1 to C4 at the open game opening of the Italian game, and at the third Saturday at the moves of the queen's bishop in the development from C1 to F4 at the open game, and at the fourth Saturday at the same patient Devon manner with the Wedgwood Jasperware pieces brought out on the board at the South Porch table, and at the 5th Saturday, and at the 6th, and at the 7th, with Francis reading aloud from the great-aunt's Philidor 1749 first edition, the opening of the Italian game, in the original French of Philidor's Analyse du jeu des échecs, of the 1749 first edition at the South Porch table. Pawn to king's 4, pawn to king's 4, knight to king's bishop 3, knight to queen's bishop 3, bishop to queen's bishop 4, bishop to queen's bishop 5. In her own quiet English summary at the South Porch table at the patient Devon pace of the Saturday parish school class, with the Wedgwood Jasperware pieces moved at each line of Philidor's French at the centre of the South Porch table, and Hetty Trembath calling the answer at the next move from her copybook in the soft round Devon hand of the Bramford Speke Girls' School, and Faith Polwale writing down the moves of the Italian game opening in the algebraic notation at her slate, in the gentle care of a parish solicitor's daughter who had learned her letters at Cathedral Yard at the Exeter parsonage of her late father, and Sophie Carew and Bryony Russell at the opposite end of the long oak South Porch table, working through the bishop's diagonals at the empty board, with the Wedgwood Jasperware pieces set off to one side at the cream linen South Porch cloth. The great-aunt's Philidor 1749 first edition open at the South Porch table at the Italian game pages of the back half of the volume. The 6 village girls' copybooks, filling at the quiet Devon pace of a parish school Saturday at the South Porch of Prideaux Court above the X, at the patient settled hand of a Devon parsonage daughter at her own correspondence game years with Mr. Lewis and Mr. Sarrat. Mr. Champernowne walked the home pasture at the morning round in his plain dark coat and weathered Devon hat. His stride settled at the steward's pace of 40 years at the Prideaux fences. On a Wednesday morning at the South Library in the 3rd week of March, the 22nd of the month, Frances took down her late great-aunt's Philidor 1749 first edition from the South Library writing table, where it had stood under her own hand at the King's Bishop's Gambit through the winter. Opened it at the King's Gambit pages at the back half of the volume to refresh her memory of Philidor's analysis at the Bishop's check on move 3, and found at the top margin of the first King's Gambit page, in a gentle italic Devon hand she had not at the South Library before, remarked the date 14th May 1791, and a marginal note in French and English mixed, Le Gambit du Roi, Philidor's defence at the pawn on f3, examined this morning at the South Library, at the kindness of Sir Theodore, H.P. 1791. And turning the page, she found at the second King's Gambit page, in the same gentle italic, the date 8th September 1792, and a fresh note at Philidor's analysis of the Bishop's check, and at the third page in the same italic the date 17th March 1793, and at the fourth page the date 22nd November 1793, and at the fifth page the date 6th May 1794, and at every King's Gambit page through the back of the Philidor volume, a fresh dated note in the same gentle italic hand. 28 years of analysis at every King's Gambit page from 1791 through to 1819 in Mrs. Honoria's own settled Devon hand, the early notes in the French of Sir Theodore's library, the middle notes in the mixed French and English of a Devon widow at the South Library writing table, the later notes at the plain English of an old Devon hand who had read Surratt at the Parish Post and Lewis at the Parish Post and worked the King's Gambit pages at her own quiet pace at the South Library through the seasons of Prideaux Magna. Frances turned the leaves at the patient pace of a Devon parsonage daughter who had learned to read her late father's own marginal notes at the Cathedral Yard study, came at length to the last King's Gambit page at the back half of the Philidor volume, and found at the bottom margin in the same gentle italic, the hand a touch thinner at the last, the ink the same Parish Post indigo, a final marginal note dated 9th November 1819, 7 days before Mrs. Honoria's death at the South Chamber of Prideaux Court at the age of 73. My great-niece's notebook 3rd at the South Parsonage at Exeter. She has Philidor and Surratt. She has the openings. She has the matter at her hand. H.P. Frances closed the Philidor 1749 first edition at the South Library writing table of Prideaux Court above the X, and stood at the South Library window in plain unrelieved black mourning gabardine, her plait at the nape under the plain dark morning cap, the soft pale grey Devon Wednesday at the south meadow beyond the panes, the Exie running pewter at the bottom of the home pasture, Mrs. Carew at the brick hob in the south kitchen at her plain plum bombazine and her lace cap silent, Mr. Trembath at the south porch in his plain black tailcoat silent, Mr. Champernowne at the home pasture in his plain dark coat silent, the South Library silent at the slow tick of the Devon mantelpiece and at the slow Devon rain at the south meadow beyond the panes, and Frances did not weep and did not speak. She stood at the South Library window for the length of a parish hour in plain unrelieved black mourning gabardine, the closed Philidor at her hand, the great-aunt's 28 years of King's Gambit annotation at her elbow on the South Library writing table, the Wedgwood Jasperware chess set of 1796 set out at the writing table at the King's Bishop's Gambit of her own correspondence game with Mr. Lewis at the move of the previous evening at her own settled hand, and the Devon Wednesday went forward at the slow pace of a parish march at the South Library of Prideaux Court above the X, and at length she came back from the South Library window to the South Library writing table and took up her own octavo notebook the three, opened it at the central crease where she had kept the long Lewis correspondence summary of the autumn of 1819 at the Parish Post pace of Cathedral Yard, dipped her plain steel pen at the South Library inkstand of plain green Devon glass, and copied the marginal note of the 9th of November 1819 into her own gentle Devon hand at the central crease of Notebook 3, in the careful slope she had used at Cathedral Yard since 1815 at her late father's south parlour writing table, signed her own initial F.P. at the bottom of the entry, blotted the entry at the parish post sand of plain Devon, silver grey, and set Notebook 3 beside the Prideaux 1749 first edition at the South Library writing table, at the steady pace of a Devon parsonage daughter who had kept her own analytical hand at Sarrat and at Prideaux for the 24 years she had been able to read the chessboard at her late father's south parlour writing table at the Exeter parsonage of Cathedral Yard. Lady Day, the quarter day at the 25th of March, Mr. Champernowne brought up the quarter's rent roll of the home pasture, and the south meadow, and the apple orchard at the east, and the long Exyside meadow at the south, and the home pasture audit, and the quarter book of the steward of 40 years at the Prideaux fences at the South Library writing table of Prideaux Court above the X, and Frances signed the steward's quarter book at her own gentle Devon hand in the plain black indigo of the parish post at the same patient parsonage slope she had kept at Cathedral Yard. In the middle of April, Mrs. Carew brought down from the great-aunt's chamber at the south chamber of Prideaux Court above the Exeter the Prideaux family pearls, Exeter, 1789, of the Exeter silversmith's mark of Edward Lavers at the High Street of Exeter in the year of the family's commission, in the long worked silver case at her great-grandmother's own settled hand, and set them in plain Devon silence at the South Library writing table for Frances's own settled use at the half-morning to come. On the Wednesday following, the 12th of the month, the 6 village girls brought up at the south porch of Prideaux Court, above the X, their fresh wildflower album of Devon spring flowers, gathered at the home pasture hedges and the X meadow margins and the apple orchard at the east of the south garden, through the soft, pale Devon days of late March and early April, the first primrose, the early cowslip, the bluebell of the Exyside coppice, the wood anemone of the home pasture hedge, the celandine of the south meadow ditch, the violet of the orchard margin, with Frances's own gift of a plain calf-bound Aesop's fables in English at each girl's hand from the South Library shelf. In the closing week of April, the strict, unrelieved black of Frances's deep mourning eased at Mr. Polwale's settled advice into the cream and grey muslin half-mourning of a Devon gentlewoman who had kept the deep black through the winter at the South Library at the testatrix's quiet wish. The cream muslin of Devon weave at the bodice, the grey of soft Devon dove at the sash and the half-sleeve, the plain cream and grey straw bonnet at the parish post pace of late spring. On Easter Sunday, the 23rd of April in the year 1820, Frances came down the south porch of Prideaux Court in plain cream and grey muslin of Devon weave, a sprig of early Devon primrose at her bodice, the Prideaux pearls of Exeter 1789 at her neck, Miss Tamsin Carew at her elbow in plain dove-grey wool, and crossed the home pasture to the parish church of St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna for the Easter service, the Devon sky, a soft pale primrose at the east, the south meadow running yellow at the first Devon cowslip, the Exy running silver at the bottom of the home pasture. Reverend Coleridge, 9 and 40, in his plain black gown, read the Easter office at the parish church at the slow Devon pace of his 29 years at the Prideaux living, and Frances sat at the Prideaux pew at the south aisle in cream and grey muslin with the sprig of early Devon primrose at her bodice and the Prideaux pearls at her neck, Miss Carew beside her, Mr. Champernowne and Mr. Trembath at the parish clerk's row, Mrs. Carew at the housekeeper's pew, the 6 village girls at the parish school bench at the north aisle in their plain straw bonnets, and the Easter office went forward at the parish pace of an Exe Valley spring. After the service, the parish came out at the south porch of St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna into the soft, pale Devon Easter morning, and at the south porch, Reverend Coleridge in his plain black gown brought forward, in the parish manner of a Devon curate, at the south porch of a Devon parish church, a gentleman whom Francis had not before seen at Prideaux Magna, and who had ridden up that Easter morning from the south at the Dart Valley above Totnes, Lord Quentin Aubrey Beaupre, the 5th Baron Beaupre of Beaupre Park. The 5th Baron Beaupre was tall, lean, 6'1", and upright, dark chestnut hair, lately silvering at the temples, calm grey-blue eyes the colour of the Devon dart at autumn, weathered, fair, Cambridge-trained complexion, plain honey-fawn morning coat over plain cream waistcoat, the silver Beaupre signet on his right hand. Reverend Coleridge made the introduction in the parish manner at the south porch of St. Petrox, at the slow Devon pace of his 29 years, at the living, verbatim, Miss Prideaux, His Lordship, Quentin Aubrey Beaupre, 5th Baron Beaupre, of Beaupre Park, 10 miles south on the Dart Valley above Totnes. Lord Beaupre is the lay patron of the Prideaux living and a Fellow of the Royal Society these 4 years past. Frances inclined at the south porch in plain cream and grey muslin with the sprig of early Devon primrose at her bodice and the Prideaux pearls of Exeter, 1789, at her neck, her plait at the nape, her grey-blue eyes the colour of the Exe estuary at autumn level at the parish meeting, and Lord Beaupre inclined at the south porch in plain honey-fawn morning coat with the silver Beaupre signet at his right hand, and the Cambridge gravity of 16 years at Trinity and 4 years at the Royal Society, at the slow Devon manner of the south porch of St. Petrox. Lord Beaupre spoke at the south porch in the plain measured English of a Devon Cambridge fellow, at the parish manner of an Easter Sunday porch, observed that he had known the late Mrs. Honoria Prideaux at the South Library of Prideaux Court these 5 years past, from 1814 through to her death in 1819 at correspondence chess with Mr. William Lewis at his St. James's Street chess room, that he had himself maintained a correspondence game with Mrs. Honoria at the King's Gambit, accepted through the winter of 1815-1816, and a correspondence game at the Italian game through the winter of 1817 to 1818 at Beaupre Park, 10 miles south on the Dart Valley above Totnes, that at the September parish school inspection of 1819 at the south parlour of Prideaux Court. He, at the parish school inspection in his lay patron capacity, at the warm written invitation of Mrs. Honoria, and at the warm parish welcome of Reverend Coleridge. He had seen, at Reverend Coleridge's hand, at the south parlour writing table, one of Mrs. Honoural's Philidor annotation pages, at the King's Bishop's Gambit, at move 3 of the Bishop's check, and had remarked at Reverend Coleridge's hand at the south parlour that the analytical observation was of the Cambridge quality he had himself heard at Trinity in 1803 at the chess room of the Master's Lodge in the open hand of the late Professor Vince, that he had not, in the 4 years he had held the Beaupre Park Library at the Dart Valley above Totnes, expected to see that quality of analytical hand continue at the South Library of Prideaux Court above the Exe, that he had ridden up that Easter morning from Beaupre Park on the Dart Valley above Totnes at the warm parish invitation of Reverend Coleridge for the Easter office at St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna in the soft, pale Devon morning of the 23rd of April, and that he should not at the south porch of St. Petrox at the Easter morning have presumed to address Miss Prideaux at the Easter service of her late great-aunt's parish church, but for the parish school report at Reverend Coleridge's hand at the south parlour writing table of Prideaux Court of the Saturday parish school chess class, at the south porch, at the moves of the bishops, and at the openings of Philidor's Analyse, at the patient Devon Saturday pace, of Miss Prideaux's own hand. Frances inclined at the south porch in plain cream and grey muslin, with the sprig of early Devon primrose at her bodice, and the Prideaux pearls of Exeter 1789 at her neck, her grey-blue eyes the colour of the Exe estuary at autumn level, at the parish meeting, the Easter Devon morning at the south porch of St. Petrock's, of Prideaux Magna soft pale primrose, at the east and the south meadow yellow, at the first Devon cowslip at the home pasture, and answered Lord Beaupre at the south porch in the plain measured English of a Devon parsonage daughter, at the same gentle gravity she had kept at Cathedral Yard, at her late father's south parlour, these 28 years of her own quiet Devon life. Lord Beaupre. The Philidor, at Prideaux. I shall continue at my late great-aunt's settled wish. Lord Beaupre inclined at the south porch, in plain honey-fawn morning coat, over plain cream waistcoat, with the silver Beaupre signet at his right hand, did not press the parish meeting at the south porch of St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna beyond the parish manor of an Easter Sunday porch in the year 1820, and observed only, at the same slow Cambridge gravity of his 16 years at Trinity and his 4 years at the Royal Society, that he should, at his lay patron capacity, inquire at Reverend Coleridge's hand, in the parish post at Prideaux Manor, whether he might at the parish convenience of Miss Prideaux call, at the south porch of Prideaux Court, above the Exe, at the Tuesday morning of the parish following, that he should bring up at the south porch of Prideaux Court his own 1817 Totnes octavo. Notes on the Italian game at Beaupre Park, of 48 pages at the Beaupre Park Library Press, of plain Devon paper and plain Devon binding for Miss Prideaux's own use at the South Library writing table at her own gentle Devon pace, that he should bring up at the same Tuesday call at the south porch of Prideaux Court, above the Exe his own 3/8 notebook of King's Gambit accepted analysis, at the same Cambridge analytical hand he had kept at Beaupre Park since 1814 at his correspondence game with Mrs. Honoria, that he should at the south porch of Prideaux Court, above the Exe, defer to Miss Prideaux's own settled hand at the South Library writing table at her own Surratt and Philidor correspondence years with Mr. Lewis and Mr. Surratt, and that he should at the south porch of St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna at the Easter morning of the 23rd of April, leave Miss Prideaux at the parish meeting of an Easter porch in the soft pale Devon morning above the Exe at the parish manor of an Easter Sunday, and the Cambridge gravity of a 5th Baron of the Dart Valley above Totnes, who had not in the 4 years at Beaupre Park expected to see at the South Library of Prideaux Court the Cambridge analytical hand continue, and that he was Miss Prideaux's most settled and obedient servant at the south porch of St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna on Easter Sunday, the 23rd of April in the year of our Lord, 1820. Frances inclined at the south porch in plain cream and grey muslin, and the Prideaux pearls and the sprig of early Devon primrose at her bodice, her plait at the nape, her grey-blue eyes the colour of the Exe estuary at autumn level at the parish meeting, and Lord Beaupre rode away from the south porch of St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna at the soft pale Devon Easter morning, at the slow steady pace of a Cambridge Baron of the Dart Valley above Totnes, returning to Beaupre Park, 10 miles south, and Reverend Coleridge at the south porch in his plain black gown, inclined in the parish manor at Miss Prideaux's elbow, and observed in his quiet Devon English that the late Mrs. Honoria Prideaux had at her own settled wish at the south parlour of Prideaux Court, above the Exe, a year past, at the September parish school inspection of 1819, set the Philidor annotation page at his own hand at the south parlour writing table at the warm parish manor of a Devon widow at the South Library, and that Francis had at Easter Sunday at the south porch of St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna, in plain cream and grey muslin, with the sprig of early Devon primrose at her bodice, and the Prideaux pearls of Exeter 1789 at her neck, answered Lord Beaupre at the south porch of the parish church, at her late great-aunt's settled wish, at the plain English of a Devon parsonage daughter, at the south library of Prideaux Court, above the Exe, and that the parish should at the south porch of St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna, on the Easter Sunday morning of the 23rd of April, in the year of our Lord, 1820 be at the slow Devon pace of an Exe Valley spring at the soft pale primrose of an Easter morning at the south meadow of Prideaux Court, above the Exe at the cowslip yellow of the home pasture, and the silver of the Exe running at the bottom of the south meadow, and that Miss Prideaux should at her own gentle Devon pace go up the south porch of Prideaux Court, at her own settled hand at the south library writing table, to her late great-aunt's Philidor 1749 first edition at the King's Gambit pages, and her own 3 octavo notebooks of Philidor and Sarrat analysis, and the Wedgwood Jasperware chess set of 1796 at the South Library writing table at the patient Devon pace of an Easter Sunday, at the south porch of Prideaux Court, above the Exe, in the soft, pale Devon morning of the 23rd of April in the year 1820, at the warm parish manor of Reverend Coleridge, at her elbow, at the south porch of St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna. Saturday the 6th of May in the year of our Lord, 1820 came mild and pale grey over Prideaux Court, with the Exe running clear in the south meadow, and the apple orchard at the east in late blossom, and at a little after the noon hour Mr. Trembath, the butler in plain black tailcoat, brought up at the South Library the calling card of Lord Beaupre of Beaupre Park, together with the cards of 3 further members of his lordship's family, who waited at the south porch in his lordship's barouche. Frances Prideaux, tall and upright in the half-mourning cream and grey muslin she had now worn these 3 weeks since Easter, with the late mother's small silver locket at her throat, and her soft dark hair plaited at the nape in the considered Devon fashion of the parsonage, took the cards at the South Library writing table, and read them in the even Devon silence she had kept all her life. The Philidor 1749 first edition lay open at her hand at the King's Gambit accepted, and the green calf chess journal lay beside it with the pencil-cleaning cloth folded into the spine. She gave Mr. Trembath her instruction in the even tone of the Exeter parsonage. The party were to be received in the South Library, and Mrs. Carew was to bring up the tea. Lord Beaupre came up at the South Library door in his plain honey-fawn morning coat over the plain cream waistcoat, the silver Beaupre signet at his right hand, the dark chestnut hair lately silvering at the temples, the calm grey-blue eyes, the colour of the Devon dart at autumn, meeting hers across the writing table in a settled Devon civility. He inclined to her in the manner of the Trinity Cambridge man he had been these 16 years past, and he presented to her his daughter, his elder sister, his brother-in-law, and his mother the dowager. Lady Adela Beaupre, 8 years old, soft auburn hair in 2 grey ribbons, grey-blue eyes the colour of the dart at autumn after the manner of her father, in plain cream muslin with a small grey sash at the waist, made her curtsy with a measured small-girl gravity that Frances received in the same measured Devon silence she had kept at the Exeter parsonage in her own 8th year. Lady Margaret Beaupre Champernowne, 40, the Baron's married elder sister, tall and upright in dove-grey twilled silk with a plain lace cap, gave her the steady Beaupre incline. Mr. Geoffrey Champernowne, 44, her husband, of the Champernownes of Dartington above Totnes, plain dark wool, weathered and steady, gave the older country gentleman's incline. The Dowager Lady Beaupré, 66, in plain black bombazine with a widow's cap of plain white lace, leaning a little upon a polished cherrywood stick, came up at her son's arm and gave Francis the slow Beaupré smile she had not given at the south porch of St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna these 4 Easters past. Mrs. Carew, the Prideaux housekeeper, 55, in her plum bombazine with the lace cap of the senior house at the South Library door for 27 years past, brought up the tea things upon the small silver tray and set them at the South Library tea table at the south window, above the X. Miss Tamsin Carew, 24, the reading companion, in plain cream muslin, took up her station at the writing table, a measured pace, to one side. The Devon afternoon light fell pale grey across the Wedgwood jasperware chess set of 1796 at the South Library writing table, and the Philidor at Francis's hand stayed open at the King's Gambit page where she had set it. Lord Beaupré took the offered chair at the south window and put the matter of his call in the plain Devon manner the Baron had kept these 4 years since the death of Lady Maria. He had at the Easter Sunday porch at St. Petrox of Prideaux Magna remarked in measured terms upon the late Mrs. Honoria's Philidor annotations at the Reverend Coleridge's hand. He had since, at Beaupré Park, taken down his own copy of the Annalise and reviewed at his evenings the Italian game pages which the late Lady Maria had taught him at the South Library at Beaupré Park between 1809 and 1816. The chess demonstration at the South Library at Beaupré Park, he said in his even Beaupré tone, had stood neglected these 4 years since Lady Maria's death in the autumn of 1816, and he asked Miss Prideaux, in the measured Devon manner that he understood her to keep, whether she might at her own warm convenience lay out the demonstration anew at the South Library at Beaupré Park upon a Saturday of her own appointing. Francis answered him in the even Devon tone of the Exeter parsonage. The demonstration at the South Library at Beaupré Park she should at her warm convenience be pleased to lay out, and she should bring with her the Wedgwood jasperware set of 1796 and the Greencalf chess journal and the Philidor at her hand. Lady Adela, seated at the small footstool at her father's knee with her grey-ribboned hands folded, looked up to Francis across the tea-table in the slow grey-blue Beaupré gaze. She asked, in the plain, measured, small-girl Devon manner she had been taught at the South Library at Beaupré Park, whether she might at the demonstration be permitted to help with the white pawns. Francis answered her in the same even Devon tone she had given the father. The white pawns at the demonstration at the South Library at Beaupré Park she should be pleased to have at Lady Adela's hand. Lady Margaret and Mr. Champernowne exchanged the steady married glance of 12 years standing across the tea-table. The Dowager set down her teacup and gave the slow Beaupré smile a second time. Mrs. Carew at the South Library door, the tea-tray now set, gave Miss Tamsin Carew the housekeeper's settled look. The Devon afternoon at the south window above the Exie stood pale grey and even, and the apple orchard at the east beyond the south garden carried the late blossom scent in at the open south casement. The call ran in this measured Devon manner 3/4 of an hour by the South Library clock. Lord Beaupré spoke of the Royal Society dining at Somerset House the previous winter, of Sir Humphrey Davy's address to the Fellows in November, and of the Cambridge correspondence he kept at Trinity with the master of his college. Lady Margaret spoke of her 3 boys at Eton, of her girl at the Champernowne nursery at Dartington, and of the Dart Valley in late May. Mr. Champernowne spoke of the home farm at Beaupré Park, of the cider apples in late blossom at the East Orchard, and of the dry stone wall at the South Meadow above the Dart. The Dowager spoke of her late husband, the 4th Baron, of the chess set at the South Library at Beaupré Park, which had come down at her marriage in 1780, and of the considered manner in which Lady Maria had laid out the Italian game pages at the Saturday afternoons of the 4 years she had been mistress at the park. Frances received them at the South Library writing table in the even Devon manner of the parsonage. She put before them the Prideaux and the journal at her hand. She set out the King's Gambit accepted at the Wedgwood board, and she gave Lady Adela the White Queen's pawn to advance upon the third square to begin the demonstration. Lady Adela took it in her small ribboned hand and set it down at the considered small girl pace her father had taught her at the South Library at Beaupre Park. At the close of the call, Lord Beaupre at the South Library door inclined to Frances in the Beaupre civility, and he asked, in the measured manner of a man who had kept his Devon pace these 4 widowed years, whether he might at her warm convenience call at Prideaux Court of a Tuesday in the South Library between the present month and the Michaelmas quarter. Frances answered him in the even Devon manner of the parsonage. A Tuesday call at the South Library, with Miss Carew at the writing table, she should be at her convenience pleased to receive. So the Tuesday calls at the South Library at Prideaux Court began on the 9th of May and continued through the months of May and June in the measured Devon pace Lord Beaupre had asked for. Miss Tamsin Carew at the writing table took up the chaperone's office in the plain cream muslin she had worn at the call of the 6th, and Mrs. Carew at the South Library door brought up the tea things at the half-hour after 3. The Wedgwood jasperware set lay between them at the South Library writing table, and the Prideaux 1749 first edition lay open at the King's Gambit page where Frances had set it. Lord Beaupre brought up at the second Tuesday call his own copy of his 1817 Notes on the Italian Game at Beaupre Park, printed by Mr. Hannaford at Totnes in the autumn of that year. Octavo, 48 pages, plain dark calf, with the silver Beaupre signet stamped at the upper board. Frances received it at the writing table and read it through at the Tuesday afternoons of May. They discussed at the second Tuesday Greco's 1620 analysis of the Italian game as it stood against Lopez's 1561 Libro de la Invención Liberal y Arte del Juego de las Cedrex, and they set out at the Wedgwood board the move orders the 2 old Italian and Spanish masters had given. Lord Beaupre put it to her at the third Tuesday that Greco's pace at the Italian game stood against Lopez's pace at the Ruy Lopez, as the Devon careful pace stood against the older Spanish, and Frances answered him at her even tone that the Italian and the Spanish carried each its own measure and were not at the table at one pace. On the Tuesday of the 23rd of May, at the reading lectern at the south window, where Lord Beaupre had set out his Notes at the open page of the Italian game, Frances looked up from the writing table at the considered Devon turn of the page and caught his grey-blue eyes, a measured 1 moment too late to look away in the even manner she had kept all her 4 parsonage and Prideaux years, and she set down the pencil at the journal in the same even Devon silence in which she had set it down all her chess correspondence days. The Wednesday walks of May and June ran in the same measured Devon pace at the South Meadow at Prideaux Court. Lord Beaupre called at the South Porch at the half-hour after 2, and Frances came down in her cream and grey muslin with her grey kid half-boots, and they walked the South Meadow at the X at the home pasture pace Mr. Champernowne, the steward, had walked the boundary at every quarter-day these 21 years past. Miss Tamsin Carew walked at a measured 5 paces behind in the manner of the South Library at Beaupre Park. On the Wednesday of the 7th of June, at the dry stone wall above the X at the corner of the South Meadow, where the Devon primrose grew in the pale grey grass at the foot of the wall, Lord Beaupre bent down at the wall in the plain Devon manner of the Cambridge trained man he was, and gathered a single sprig of the late Devon primrose between his finger and his thumb. He stood up at the dry stone wall and put the sprig at Frances's hand in the considered Devon silence he had kept at the wall of the home pasture at Beaupre Park these 4 widowed years past, and Frances took it at her hand in the even Devon silence of the Exeter parsonage. She did not at the wall speak to him, and he did not speak to her. They walked back at the home pasture pace, to the south porch at Prideaux Court, and at the south library writing table, Frances placed the sprig of Devon primrose into the linen pouch at the spine of the green calf chest journal with the pencil-cleaning cloth she had carried at the south library at the parsonage these 5 years past. At the last Saturday of June, Lord Beaupre at the south porch put it to her in the plain Devon manner that he might at her warm convenience attend at the south library at Prideaux Court, not only at Tuesday, but at Saturday, also between the present and the Michaelmas quarter. Frances answered him, at her even Devon tone of the parsonage, that the Saturday call at the south library at Prideaux Court, with Miss Carew at the writing table, she should at her convenience be pleased to receive. So the Saturday calls were added to the Tuesday calls at the south library at Prideaux Court through the month of July, at the quarter hour after 3, by the south library clock, and the Philidor at Frances's hand, and the notes on the Italian game at his lordship's hand stood open at the writing table between them. On the Saturday of the 5th of August, in that year of 1820, at 3 by the south library clock at Prideaux Court, Lord Beaupre called at the south porch alone, in his plain honey-fawn morning coat over the plain cream waistcoat, the silver Beaupre signet at his right hand, the calm grey-blue eyes at the south library door, meeting Frances's at the writing table in the measured Devon civility he had kept these 4 months past. Mr. Trembath brought him up at the south library, and Miss Tamsin Carew took up her station at the writing table a measured pace to one side, and Mrs. Carew at the south library door set down the tea-tray and withdrew at the housekeeper's settled pace. Lord Beaupre took the offered chair at the south window above the X. He sat down at the small mahogany table at his elbow, his own copy of his 1817 Notes, and the plain dark calf octavo notebook he had kept at Beaupre Park these 4 years past. He did not at the south library reach for the teacup. He looked across the writing table at Frances in the even Devon manner of the Cambridge-trained baron he was, and he put to her his asking in the 7 sentences of the careful Devon pace. Miss Prideaux, I have known the late Mrs. Honoria's Philidor at correspondence chess these 5 years past at Beaupre Park. I have come, having read with measured admiration the careful Philidor analysis at your hand these 4 years, to ask you to consider whether you might be the next Lady Beaupre at the careful Devon pace your own Lewis correspondence has taught me to admire. I do not ask at the haste of the Exeter Assembly or at the haste of the London season. I ask at the pace of the South Library at Beaupre Park, which the late Lady Maria kept until 1816. I ask at the pace your own late mother, Mrs. Cassandra Prideaux, née Courtenay, kept all her days at the Exeter parsonage. I shall, at your warm convenience, receive your answer. Frances Prideaux, at the South Library writing table, set down the pencil upon the open page of the green calf chess journal in the even Devon manner of the parsonage. She looked up at his grey-blue eyes across the writing table in the same even Devon tone she had given him at the call of the 6th of May. Lord Beaupre, I shall. The Wedgwood jasperware set lay between them at the writing table, and the Philidor lay open at the King's Gambit page, and the sprig of Devon primrose at the linen pouch at the spine of the journal had been there at her hand these 8 weeks past. Miss Tamsin Carew at the South Library door dropped her measured curtsy to the master of Beaupre Park, and Mrs. Carew at the South Library door, who had now come back up at the half-hour, gave her ward the housekeeper's settled glance, and withdrew at the housekeeper's settled pace to send word to Mr. Champernowne at the home farm. That evening at the small south parlour at Beaupre Park, Lord Beaupre called up his daughter Lady Adela, in her plain cream muslin with the grey sash at the waist, and he set her at his knee at the small fender at the south parlour fire, and put the matter to her in the plain Devon manner he had kept all her short 8-year life. He told her in the measured fatherly tone that Miss Prideaux of Prideaux Court had agreed to be the next Lady Beaupré at Beaupré Park, and that she should at Michaelmas be at the South Library at Beaupré Park with the Wedgwood Jasperware set of 1796 and the Philidor at her hand. Lady Adela received it at her small grey-blue gaze and gave her father the measured small-girl nod of the Devon nursery she had been taught at, and she said in the considered small-girl tone that she should at the demonstration at the South Library at Beaupré Park have the white pawns at her hand. The banns were read at St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna by Reverend Coleridge on the Sundays of the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th of August, in the plain measured Devon manner of the curate of 27 years. The whole parish at Prideaux Magna and the parish at the park heard them at the 3 Sundays, and Mrs. Trembath, the village dressmaker of Prideaux Magna, 52, in plain dark wool with a plain white apron, came up at the south porch at Prideaux Court at the Tuesday of the 15th of August with the cream Devon muslin morning gown she had stitched at her cottage at the village these 3 weeks past, and Francis received her at the South Library, in the even Devon manner of the parsonage. So the wedding day came at Prideaux Magna on the Saturday of the 9th of September in that year of 1820 at the church of St. Petrock's by Reverend Coleridge at 10 by the church clock. The morning was pale grey at the south porch of the church, and the exe at the south meadow ran clear, and the apple orchard at the east of Prideaux Court carried the early cider scent at the south casement of the South Library, where Francis had dressed at Miss Tamsin Carew's hand and at Mrs. Carew's hand at the half-hour after 8. Francis Prideaux at the south porch of St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna stood at the considered Devon pace of the parsonage in the cream Devon muslin morning gown Mrs. Trembath had stitched at her cottage with the sprig of late summer Devon primrose and the small white and cream rose at her bodice in the plain Devon manner Mrs. Carew had pinned at the South Library at the half-hour after 9, the Prideaux family pearls of Exeter, 1789, at her throat, the ivory silk gloves she had carried from the Exeter parsonage at her hands, and the late mother, Mrs. Cassandra Prideaux, née Courtenay's small silver locket folded into the inner pocket at the bodice in the considered Devon manner her late mother had kept all her days at the parsonage. Mr. Polwell, the Exeter solicitor of Cathedral Yard, 60, in his plain dark wool with his gold spectacles at his nose, gave her at the south porch of the church the formal Devon arm of the family solicitor, and walked her up the aisle of St. Petrock's of Prideaux Magna at the measured pace he had walked the cathedral close at Exeter these 31 years past. Reverend Coleridge, at the chancel step in his plain black gown, took the Devon form of marriage at the careful pace of the curate of 27 years, and Lord Beaupré gave his vow at the measured Cambridge tone of the South Library at Beaupré Park, and Frances gave hers at the even Devon tone of the parsonage. Lady Adela, at the front pew at the dowager's plum silk side, held the small grey-ribboned posy Mrs. Carew had given her at the south porch, and watched her father at the chancel step in the grey-blue Beaupré gaze. After the service, the wedding breakfast was set at the south dining-room at Prideaux Court at the long mahogany table that had stood at Prideaux these 73 years past. Mr. Trembath the butler, in his plain black tailcoat, set out the 86 pieces of Prideaux family plate of Exeter the 1789 along the plain linen tablecloth that had come down at the marriage of Sir Theodore Prideaux in 1791, and Mrs. Carew at the sideboard put out the cold ham of the home farm and the Devon junket of the kitchen dairy, and the early plum cake she had baked at the Prideaux kitchen on the Friday past, and Miss Tamsin Carew brought up the tea and the small ale at the half-hour after 11. The Dowager Lady Beaupré, at the head of the table, at the bridegroom's right hand, gave the slow Beaupré smile a measured 3rd time, and set down at her plate the small gold-stopped scent bottle she had carried at her own wedding breakfast at Beaupré Park in the autumn of 1780. Lady Adela, at her father's left hand, set her small grey-ribboned posy at the plate before her, and watched the exe at the south casement in the slow grey-blue beaupré gaze, and Mr. Polwell at the foot of the table gave the family solicitor's measured incline at the new mistress of the park. Here ends the chronicle of Miss Frances Prideaux of Exeter, who became, by the patient asking of the 5th Baron Beaupré, the 7th Lady Beaupré of Beaupré Park, in the careful Devon fashion her own late grandmother had kept all her days. Silken Embrace. Mr. Champernowne continued at the home farm. Mrs. Carew continued at the housekeeper's keys. The quarter-day audit went forward at Michaelmas. Miss Carew continued at the South Library evenings with the Philidor at her hand. Outside, the Devon sky turned the colour of slate after rain at the close of the September day, and the Exe ran the colour of pewter at the South Meadow. So, Miss Frances Prideaux, who had sat in even Devon silence at the south parlour window of the Exeter parsonage on the soft Saturday morning of the 20th of November, and finished her correspondence move with Mr. Surratt at the King's Gambit accepted, became, by the patient asking of the 5th Baron Beaupré, the 7th Lady Beaupré of Beaupré Park, in the careful Devon fashion her own late mother, Mrs. Cassandra Prideaux, née Courtenay, had kept all her days.